So today we'll try to get an overview of what the ventricular system of the brain is made up of from an anatomical point of view. So coming to the first slide. So this is how when we dissect out the whole ventricles. What do you mean by ventricle, anybody? So it's a cavity, right? So we are basically talking about what are the cavities that are present in the brain. So as already mentioned by you people, so we are looking at the cavities within the brain. And why do we need these cavities? Any idea what is present in it? You're right. So basically the whole brain is surrounded by a fluid, a different kind of fluid which is separate from the blood, and that is called as the cerebrospinal fluid. Now the cerebrospinal fluid suspends the brain within itself. Why do we need this fluid for the brain to be suspended? Any idea?
Buoyancy.
Yes, buoyancy. Why do you need the effect of buoyancy here?
To lessen the weight of brain.
So if at all, what is the normal weight of brain? Anybody?
1200.
Yeah, somewhere between 1200 to 1500 grams. Imagine you're holding a weight of 1.5 kg on your neck. You would have always had your head sinking down, and we don't want that to happen. So in order to reduce the weight from 1.5 kg to 150 grams, the nature uses the effect of buoyancy here by putting the brain into a fluid or a pool of fluid called as the cerebrospinal fluid, which is specific to the brain cavity. So that needs to be produced somewhere. So that is where we develop these cavities within the brain, and we have these cavities which have the synthetic capacity to produce the cerebrospinal fluid. So it's a dynamic process. The cerebrospinal fluid is being produced, but then the cranial cavity is a fixed cavity. So there has to be some drainage point. So as I told, because of its dynamicity, it is being produced in the cavities called the ventricles, and then they exit out of the brain via the venous system of the brain. Now let's come to this area of cavities where the production of CSF happens. So as I already mentioned, we call it as the ventricular system, and what you see on the slide is trying to give you an overview of all the parts of the ventricular system. So if you go to the slide here, what we see here is the lateral ventricles. These lateral ventricles are the largest ventricles in the brain, present mainly in the cerebrum, and you see it continuing into another smaller cavity called as the third ventricle, and this third ventricle is communicating with the lateral ventricle. Can you see a small channel here? So that channel which communicates lateral to the third ventricle is called as the interventricular foramen or the foramen of Monro. From the third ventricle, sorry about that. So from the third ventricle, we see the fluid passing down via a very small canal which passes through the brainstem, mainly the midbrain, and that is called as the cerebral aqueduct. And from there you come down into a tent-shaped cavity, small cavity called as the fourth ventricle. And from the fourth ventricle, the CSF goes into the general subarachnoid space to ultimately drain into the venous system. So those are the parts of the ventricles of the brain. Now look at the orientation of these ventricles. We are looking from the lateral side of the brain. The lateral ventricles are predominantly present in the cerebral cavity, as you can see here, and this gets divided into four parts which will come down when we talk about them. And the four parts are mainly in the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobes. This third ventricle is mainly in the region of the deep brain nuclei. Which are the deep brain nuclei in the brain? We have a superficial and a deep gray matter. What forms the deep gray matter? That's a homework for all of you. Then we come down to the fourth ventricle, and this is present mainly between the brainstem and the cerebellum. Now look at the parts of the lateral ventricle. There are mainly four parts. The central part, which is present here, what you see here, will be the central part of the body of the lateral ventricle. Projecting into the frontal lobe, this part will be the anterior horn. The part of the lateral ventricle projecting into the posterior, that is the occipital lobe, will be the posterior horn, and the one which enters into the temporal lobe will be called as the inferior horn. So these are the four parts of the lateral ventricle. Now let's look at what's the important relations of the body of the lateral ventricle today. And we see that in the sectional view, this is mainly a coronal view, and in that we see a superior relation, this part, and an inferior relation mainly, and a septa called as the septum pellucidum, which separates the two ventricles, and this is the common channel which is communicating the central part of the body of the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. So what we see here is the third ventricle. Now coming to the superior relations, this will form mainly the corpus callosum, and inferiorly two important deep grain nuclei present here are laterally the caudate. This is the caudate, head of the caudate nucleus mainly. If you come down, we have the thalamus. Now between the caudate and the thalamus, try to appreciate the orientation. This is more laterally placed and this is more medially placed. There is a groove that is formed between the caudate and the thalamus, and that is occupied by two structures called as stria terminalis, which is a band of white matter, and the thalamostriate vein. So now that shows the relations. Let's get the orientation by using the Anavu software. So this software will give you an orientation of whatever we discussed in the past 10 minutes with relation to the radiological image, mainly looking at the in relation to the white and the gray matter. What we look here, we are looking mainly at the superior aspect of the brain. Let us look at the section. So this which is there in the the light blue color. Okay, we are having all the sections. Yeah, okay. So let's use this Anavu software to understand how the ventricular systems are oriented within the cranial cavity. As you can see here, this is the cranial cavity. This is the anterior, posterior and the lateral parts. We are looking at the cranial cavity from the top. What is this in the center which connects the two parts of the brain? What do you think it is? So basically it is the corpus callosum. On either sides of it you see a light blue structure with a protrusion behind and a protrusion below. If you look at it, and that becomes the ventricular system of the brain. So and then beneath that, can you appreciate this medially and more anteriorly placed, the dark blue color, that would be the caudate nucleus, and behind in green, which is a little laterally spaced out, would be the thalamus. So these are the two important relations with respect to the body of the lateral ventricle. Let's try to look at it from the anteroposterior point of view. So if you look at it, I have gone a little lateral from the median longitudinal fissure to appreciate the bluish color, that is the lateral ventricle, and we are trying to look at the brain from the back. So what I will do is, I'll go a little more front to appreciate the same. So this is the anterior aspect where you are mainly appreciating the ventricle in blue and the caudate nucleus. If you go a little back, you will see that a green color starts pointing out. Let's look at the back of it by rotating, because you're looking from the front, you're not appreciating it. When you look from the back, you will see that its relation. So you look at it in the floor, below the lateral ventricle body, we are having the thalamus. Okay. So as I go to the front of it, you will lose the thalamus slowly as you go to the front. Yes. And then you will start the appearance of the caudate nucleus on the medial aspect. Now let's look at the lateral view. So here you will appreciate what we saw as the parts of the lateral ventricle. So this is the one protruding into the frontal lobe, anterior horn. What we discussed about the body would be the central part, and you see the relation of the thalamus predominantly in the posterior aspect of the floor, and what you see in this dark blue is more in the anterior aspect of the floor of the body of the ventricle, and you also appreciate the superior relation in red color, that is the corpus callosum. The one protrusion behind is going to be the posterior horn into the occipital lobe. You can appreciate the occipital lobe here. This is the cerebellum, and the one into the temporal lobe will be the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. So I hope you have understood the orientation. We can have a practice session of the same, and we'll come back to the next part of the ventricles in the next class. Thank you.